Hello friends! Today we're going to take a look at how to make a sheath for an axe. We're going to make one just about like this, except instead of the snap we're going to use a little stud because it allows us to have one less tool to make this. Don't need that many tools, just a couple basic fundamentals. I think you need roughly 5 tools or so to cut this out and build it, and then roughly 5 or so tools or supplies to get all the nice color and finish and extra coat and all that stuff going. So you can find a list of all of the things that you're going to need that you're going to see me use in this video in the description. I am an Amazon associate, so if you buy anything, I may or may not get a small commission on that. It doesn't cost you anything extra, but helps support all the work that I'm doing and the channel and all that kind of good stuff. So if you want to see more stuff like this, definitely go and click those links. All right, on to the first step. So what you need to do is get some printer paper. The heavier the better, and actually if you wanted to do this out of cardstock, that would actually be really nice. Or if you have old manila envelopes or anything that's a little bit thicker, cereal boxes actually make really good patterns. And to make this a little bit easier, we're actually going to kind of do this twice. So let us trace out our axe head on one side. And then we are going to flip the axe head over. Let's line this back up. Flip the axe head over, and we just want to give a little bit of space because the paper is going to be really thin, but obviously when we get to our leather, it's a little bit thicker. So once you wrap that around, you try not to get pan on the leather, it is going to take a little bit of extra thickness to get around that. We're also going to be putting a welt in here so that you're not just going to slice out those stitches when you get your axe razor sharp. And we need that little bit of extra thickness there. So we are going to sort of iterate on this shape. So it doesn't need to be perfect here. And actually in this step, it's helpful if you actually cut it big. So that is our initial pattern there. And this is just to get the shape that we want to cover. So we're going to be adding in what people that so-called seam allowance, and we will add that in a minute. So we just want to make sure, hey, what is the sort of critical part of the pattern, the critical shape of the pattern? Do we have that all locked in? And then from there, I'll show you an easy way to get the extra seam allowance. And then actually, before I cut that, we need to cut a little bit of extra paper. So we've got this side, and then on this side, as I mentioned, we need this extra flap of leather. So let's actually just let that sit real big like that, and we will trim that up in a second. So that, if you can believe it, is essentially what our sheath is going to look like. So let's get that out like that. That is looking pretty good. We probably can make it just a hair looser. Let's actually do. That looks good. And then we've got this over here, so when we fold that over, we'll have that kind of coverage there. And let's actually just trim that extra off. And that goes really high up on the axe, and I don't really like that. So what we're going to do is put that all together like that, and we are just going to snip a little bit off like that. So now let's see where we're at. That's looking pretty good, but that is a pretty big chunk there. So actually, what if we were to, cut goes to there. what if we were to do that? How does that look? That looks pretty good. Again, still a little on the big side, but let's just leave it. I kind of like the way that looks. We can put the stud right about there. That'll hold everything in. That little point over time might start to curl, but I kind of like the point, so we'll leave it like that. All right, so now that we have the basic shape of our pattern, what we're going to do is we are going to trace this out again, and we want to be sure to mark. Let's actually go back and mark this one. So our pattern looks like this. And we want to mark right there, and right there. And that should be easy to see, but right there. Okay, we'll get that out of the way. So, all right, I think we got all of that. And actually, let's take a look at this. I don't like how that has that little hiccup there, so all we're going to do, that should still be plenty of leather there, is we're just going to line up on these 2 points. And do our pattern like that. Oh, it looks like we're actually missing a bit of the line there, so let's just go back. Put that in. Now, the problem we have right now is that all we're covering is the blade. There's nowhere to actually lay these stitches in. And the other thing is, when we add this sort of margin, we want to make this plenty big so that when we try to stitch this, we don't have a little welt that we're trying to run into. We want a nice big margin of error. Also, I like big chunky stitches, so having a little bit of more margin on there makes it look even nicer. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to have roughly a 5mm inset for my stitches. So we're just going to double that. And before you ask why I'm using metric, because this fancy little tool, which I think was only a couple bucks, is in metric. So it's really easy for me to just use that. And I totally don't think in metric. So I have no idea what that is in imperial, roughly 1/2 inch. And what we're going to do is we're just going to go along here in our pattern and just mark out where this is. And be sure to be as perpendicular as you can and make sure that you get all of these points. Because that's where the radius might change and stuff like that. So, it doesn't have to be perfect, but the more perfect it is, the better, of course. All right, so let's go back and get the rest of these. You just want to lay in enough dots that you're going to be able to trace this in a second. We're going to sand it so it doesn't need to be perfect, but hey, the more perfect it is to start, the better. With that, now all we have to do is connect the dots. And these are arcs. So don't just go straight line from dot to dot to dot. It's better to be a little bit more smooth. All right. So now that we have that, another thing that we want to keep in mind is when we cut this, we want to make sure that this is the flesh side of the leather, this furry, rough side. Because, where'd my cap go? Because if we take this pattern and cut it on this side, and then wrap it around, the flesh side would be on the other side, but we could always go back the other way, but then our closure would be on the opposite side. Something to think about. All right, so let's get this cut out, and then we can get our leather cut out. All right. All right, not too bad. Now that we have this, we need to make our welt. So we're just going to take a scrap of this leather, and we essentially need to make a duplicate of this times that little width. And I'm actually going to cut that long. And actually, let's do this the extra easy way. So, all right, let's just sketch that in there. Next step, now that we have this all cut out, is to, actually we're going to do something, I was going to say we're going to start to dye, but actually what I want to do to get that joint just a little bit nicer is I'm just going to skive this down a little bit. Now we've got our cutout pieces of leather, we've got some dye, and we've got a dauber. Now, I highly recommend Phoebing's Pro Dye. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but this stuff works amazing. I'm going to be using a dauber. You could use something like an acrylic marker you fill up or something like that. I've seen people do that, and it works pretty good, but I have the most experience using a dauber, so that's what we're going to be doing. Now, the trick here is that it's hard to tell what it's really going to look like until you're done. So if anything looks blotchy, don't try to like spot correct any of the blotches. The other thing, I'm wearing gloves. This dye stains like no other, so I've got a piece of tin foil with a piece of paper towel on top of it. So hopefully the paper towel soaks up all of the stuff, and then anything that might bleed through at least isn't getting onto my work surface.
So we're just going to get a decent dauber full. Another thing to consider is that anywhere you put the dye is going to make it stiffer. So if you want to keep this as flexible as possible, you can skip dyeing the flesh side, but I like the leather to all look the same, so I like to dye it. Now, we are going to edge dye this a different color, but just in case I change my mind, I like to dye the edges with my main color and try not to get too crazy and go over the edges like I just did, because then you get that. So I'm actually just going to do another full layer to hopefully even that out a little bit. Back on that side. And as you can see, I am liberally applying this dye. If you want it to be a lighter color, thin your dye out. Don't try to just use it sparingly or anything like that. And this piece, it's not critical at all. You're essentially not going to see it almost at all. But, hey, it's still fun to dye. So, I'm going to dye it. And we'll go back over it one more time, just like we did on the main piece. Again, it doesn't really matter, but might as well get a little bit of extra practice dyeing in. So, that is all there is to it. I'm just trying to squeeze out a little bit of the whatever dye is left in here. Not to save it, though that is nice. But so when I set this here to dry, I don't end up with a giant mess that bleeds out into the rest of my leather work.
So with that, you want to wait for it to dry completely. Something like 12 to 24 hours, I think is what these guys say. Apparently all they say on the bottle is that it's super toxic. But, yep, wait for this to dry, and then I will be back, and we'll move into gluing it up and stitching. All right, now that we've got our leather dyed, all we got to do is double check the fit. So line it up like that, and keep in mind that this piece is a hair long. We're going to trim that in a second, but let's see how we did. So line it up like that, bring that around, and hey, just about perfect. All right, so let's hold that just like that. And we've got that welt in there like so. This doesn't have to be exactly perfect. We're going to sand that down in a second. So if you can see that looks like that one side is a little bit wonky, we'll touch that up. That's not a problem at all. But all right, let's see where we're at. We just need to nip off a hair. And then also, if you're looking at all those pen lines, when we bevel the edges, those are going to come right off too. So don't have to worry about that either. So let's just take our knife. Well, where did my knife go? I'm not cutting through, I'm just marking it. And now we'll take our knife and slice that little extra bit off. Now, what we want to do is we need to put some adhesive to make this easier to stitch and to make it a little bit cleaner looking. We need to put some adhesive on here, on here, on the other side of this piece, and on this piece. So we're actually going to do this half at a time. So we'll do the glue for this, then we'll add some glue there, and then we will just fold that over and glue it. So to make this a little bit easier to figure out where we want to put glue and where we don't want glue, because we don't want just glue all over a project, I still have my dividers there at the width of this, and I'm actually going to bring it in just a hair, because we don't need glue over like the exact spot of this. We just need enough to hold it all together. So we'll just score that out. Don't score it too far. We only need to score it to just before the end. So we got our spot there. And then we might as well lay out the rest of this. And on this side, it's all covered. So we don't have to worry about where to glue and where not to glue. And this glue is some glue that I've been using for a little while now. And it's water-based. In theory, it's a little bit less toxic than the toluene stuff, but hey, it seems to be working pretty good. It dries pretty quick, and I like it so far. So all you got to do is dab a little bit of this stuff on here, and you can use, I was going to say your finger, probably don't want to use your finger, but you can use just some cheap brushes or whatever you might want to use to get that glue on there. Don't need a ton. And let's see, which way were we on this one? That way. So we want glue on this side. Alright, so we're just going to wait for this to dry. Takes just a couple minutes, and I'll be right back and show you how to press all that together. Before we stick that all together, and actually it would have been better before we even put that glue on there is one edge in particular that is going to be a giant pain to bevel after we glue all this up, and that's this edge right here. Because if you look on this guy, you want to be able to bevel right into there, and is that the biggest deal? No, it's not the biggest deal, but it'll be a lot easier to do that right now. So, just as a general note, we need to bevel, if we were to bevel all these, we need to bevel just the ones that are going to be visible from the outside and aren't going to be glued up, right? So we don't want to bevel here. That would leave a big ugly gap, and that would be lame. So we don't want to do that, but we're going to bevel all of the other edges. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to color that edge and slick that real quick. And this is really easy with one of these refillable, you can get empty acrylic markers and fill them up with your leather dye. This is a chocolate color. Looks pretty good, if I do say so myself. All right, so I'm gonna let that dry, not overnight, but just for a little bit, and then we'll be right back and we will slick those up. All right, so now we have a nice dyed edge, and we've got some options. So we could start rubbing this down with some canvas. We could even start putting some Tokonol on here. Way too much. Now we have our two pieces ready to glue up. Make sure you remember which side you tapered. And all you need to do is press that there. And you actually need to put a surprising amount of pressure on there. So, I believe what this guy says is, where is it? 1 bar, I'm sure you can't read that, but 1 bar of pressure at least it says you need to apply, which is quite a bit. If you have some fancy pliers like these, you can press that down and that gets really on there. But you don't actually need something like that. You could just take something like the mallet that you're going to need for stitching up. All right, that is good enough. And now we just need to rinse and repeat for the glue. And like I said before, you don't need a ton of this, and the only thing that you gain from putting a ton of this on here is you get to wait longer for it to dry. You see when you give this a try that all these big globs are the spots that take the longest to dry. We're actually going to try to get a little bit of a dab right in there. All right, so now we've got our glue is dry, it's nice and tacky, and all we need to do is fold this over. Get this, the most important thing here is to get this joint here as close as possible, and everything else line it up as best as you can. And like I said, we had a little bit of overhang here, but that is all right. We will get that in just a second. So, why not? We can do another test on the axe. Yep, still looking good. All right, so now just need to apply a little bit of pressure. And there we are, all nice and glued up. And because that's a decent bit of an overhang there, instead of just using sandpaper, because that would take forever, I am just going to get us in the neighborhood with my knife. There we go. That is pretty close there. A little bit of roughness. And let us sand. So I'll be right back. Let me grab my sandpaper. All right. So we've got some options. You can go with some sandpaper and a sanding block. This is just kind of a fancy one, but even just a piece of sandpaper and a block of wood, you can use that. Or if you have any sort of Dremel rotary tool of some sort, you can also use that. Now, if you're going to go that option, be very careful. What we're trying to do here is flatten this out, right? So we want this nice and smooth and flat. This guy, it is very easy. If you look at this, I don't think that's going to focus very well, but if you can imagine, this is round, and it is going to just cut straight into that edge, and it's very easy to have this be very lumpy. right? With this, there's no humanly possible way to cut lumps in. All we're going to do is smooth this out. This goes very fast. Definitely do it, preferably outside, but at least where you have some decent ventilation, it is going to throw dust everywhere. But we don't have a lot to do, so we are just going to do a little bit of hand sanding here. You can start pretty aggressive. This is an 80 grit. Perfect. Now that we have this all smooth, we've got some options. We can just move on to the next step, or if you want to get this really smooth, we can actually step down to a finer grit. So this one, again, I don't know how easy that's going to be for you to see, but that's 80 grit. So let me go get some more sandpaper, and let's take this a little bit more. So now I've got some 120 and 220 grit sandpaper. And like I said, this is all just extra. If you don't want to do this, it is totally fine. And there we are. All right. So now that we have that out of the way, let's get some of this dust out of the way. Now we just need to lay out our stitches and then punch our stitches. So what we want to do is, especially if you don't have a specific size that you usually cut for your gusset, we just want to eyeball what half looks like. But somewhere in the middle, so if anything's misaligned, we don't overshoot and miss that. That looks good. And now we are going to start punching our holes, right? That's our line. We're not going to mark this other line on the other side because we're probably not going to be perfectly perpendicular, and we don't want to have an odd random line that isn't where our stitch line is. Also, I'm not going to cut this line, so this isn't going to be super visible anyways. This is all going to be taken up by the stitching. And to do our stitching, we are going to, you could stitch it right on this, but this is really going to chew this up quick. This is more for like cutting. It's not going to self-heal if you put a bunch of holes in it. I'm going to be using one of these rubbery mats. They're very durable. They deaden the sound a little bit, and they aren't just going to get holes punched into it. These are really cheap. You can find them on Amazon. Also, a lot of leather suppliers sell them. The other thing you can use is just cheap plastic cutting boards, or even wooden cutting boards I've used before, and you can go get them at the dollar store, the grocery store, Amazon, Value Village, wherever. You could even just use a piece of wood, and then you save your cutting mat. And make sure it's decently thick. I've seen people punch on their laps. You definitely don't want to punch through your leather into your leg. That would not be fun. The other thing that I'm going to be doing is that this table is just a cheap plastic fold-out table, so it really sucks up a lot of the energy when you're punching. It's just like a blacksmith uses a really big heavy anvil because it resists all that hammering he's doing. It's the same concept here, but I'm not hammering steel, just a little bit of leather. So I have this plate of steel, another thing that I got for surprisingly cheap on Amazon. But you don't need to go buy something fancy like this if you know anybody that deals with scrap steel, or there's a machine shop near your house, or there's a metal scrap yard or something like that. Just something that's reasonably flat and heavy to put on top of your table will make a giant difference. If you have a really serious, like a woodworking workbench, like an old school, like hand tool style workbench, that'll also work really great. Big, heavy table. But if you don't have something like that, or even if you do have something like that, having a nice big heavy piece of steel under where you're doing your punching, makes a giant difference. You can also get like deadening mats and stuff like that, but as far as the actual punching goes, this is all you really need. You really only need just this or a cutting board or something, but that's all you need. Then for our stitching irons, I have 5mm irons because I like chunky stitching, and I'm going to be using this 1mm Ritza Tiger thread, and it looks really good at 5mm. You can use whatever thread you want. If you want to do thinner thread, people tend to kind of match the thread size to the stitching iron size, but it's all personal preference. Like if you were to do like 5 or 6mm with like 0.6 thread, that would look a little weird. But if that, like, it looks weird to me, but if that's what you like, go for it. Whatever you think looks good. If you want to do chunky and do what I'm doing, 5 and 1mm, or you could even use like super chunky, like 1.2mm thread, and that's all you need. The other thing is that because this is a radius, there's no straight lines here. I'm going to be using a 2-prong iron. If I were to use one of these big, wider irons, or they make even wider irons than that, these make doing straight lines really quick work, but you're going to get getting a bunch of facets in your axe sheath. Now, if you did that deliberately, that could look pretty cool, but then you'd have to deal with the funkiness of, okay, this is angular, and do I make that welt angular, or do I just make that a constant radius, or how do you lay that out? Whereas we did this the easy way. Our axe is round. We're going to make this round. All right, now let's start stitching this out. What you want to do is you want to pick a spot fairly close to where we turn that leather over. It doesn't need to be super close, but close enough. And just pick a spot to start, right in that line that we chiseled. And the key here is you want to be as perpendicular to your workpiece as possible. All right. And when you punch through there, you want to make sure you get all the way through there. This iron is not thick, long enough to get all the way through and get nice clean holes. So we need to be able to come back through here and open these up a little bit when we're done on this side. You're not going to punch all the way through back the other way, because then you get a second row of holes if you're not careful. And I'm not going to embarrass myself enough to show an example of that, but it is surprisingly easy to do. So as you're going along here, make sure you're registering one of the prongs in the last hole that you punch. And it's as simple as that, but as with everything, it is in theory simple, but in practice can be a little tricky. Didn't do too bad. Open those holes up. And see how we did. What you're going to need is you're going to need some thread and some needles. These are John James 2/0 needles, and I'm using 1mm thread. You want to match your thread size to your needle size. This is a Ritza Tiger thread. There's all sorts of charts you can find online. And that's all there is to it. Another note to go back. Again, you want to match to an extent, your stitch spacing and your thread size. But this is more of a stylistic thing. If you wanted to have, 5, 6, 7mm spacing and use really thin thread, you totally could. Not a lot of people do it, but it's an option. But your needles, you really only want a big enough needle to use your thread and to get it through your holes. The bigger the needles are, the more it sucks to get through these. So, there's that. And another thing you might need is some pliers. If you use regular needle nose pliers, you will chew up your needles like no tomorrow, and they're not going to last really long, and they can rip up your work. If you use these parallel jaw pliers, they don't rip up your needles, and they'll last a long time. And these aren't that expensive. So, our first big question here is, how much thread do we need? And the answer is, when I find the loose end, is a surprisingly large amount of thread. Now, in reality, for a big spool like this, or a medium-sized spool like this, it's not that much, but we're going to take 6 times the length of our stitching row, plus a little bit of extra. Set that aside. Now, to thread your needles, just cut an angle on the end of your thread. Get that out of here too. And that'll make it easier to get through the eye of your needle. Now you're going to stab the thread relatively close to the end of it, because the closer you get to the end, the less thread you're going to waste at the end. All right, pull that tight. Now let's go to our other end. Same thing. And that's where our other needle's going to go. All right. Now what we're going to be doing is called a saddle stitch. So to start, this is usually the hardest one to do. Pull that through, and you want to pull until your needles are just about even. Here we are. And what we're going to be doing for each of these stitches is passing both needles through the same hole and just crisscrossing along through this piece of leather. Now let me untangle all that. And the trick to getting a consistent stitch is to pick a pattern of how you're going to do everything and do it exactly the same every time. So I'm right-handed, so I put my needle in the right side first, push it through, pull it out just a little bit. Now I take my other needle, go over and back through in front of that thread. And you want to make sure you're not stabbing into that thread, you're just going in front of that thread. Now, pull everything tight. Doesn't need to be insane. See how good your grip strength is tight? Just snug is good. And now it's just rinse and repeat. So, get the needle through. Bring the other thread over and in front. Pull that through. Pull that through. And now we have 2 nice identical looking stitches. Now all that's left is to stitch the rest of these, and I'll show you how to finish it when we get there. All right. Now that we have all of that stitched, how do we finish this? It's pretty simple. We're just going to stitch back a couple stitches ending on the back, and then we'll just cut it off and cinch the ends, and you're all done. So these back stitches are exactly the same. So you just turn your piece around and start going backwards. But it is a little bit trickier. You want to make sure you don't catch one of those threads, which is surprisingly easy, and also, unsurprisingly, it is a little bit harder to get your needles through when you're doing these back stitches. You just need a couple, so it's not a big deal. But just be careful. And if it looks like you're catching a thread, just pull the needle back out and try again. All right, pull that snug. And you know what? We're actually not going to do a ton of these. We'll do one more. And then we might call it a day there. Actually, I kind of like where we're at there. I'm not really that worried about this coming out. So, we've got both our tag ends on the back of our piece. We're just going to snip those off. Not super short, but fairly short. Get the needles out of the way, get the knife out of the way. And all we're going to do is use a lighter to singe this thread down. This is a poly thread, so it will actually just melt down. And you can kind of be careful, it's hot, but lightly tap it with your finger. You can tap it with your lighter. And there we are. We are almost done. Let's just finish this edge here, and then we'll add our stud. And we'll be done. All right, and there we are. You know, I think we could have sanded a little bit more in there, but nonetheless, I think we're looking pretty good. Now the last thing we need to do is put in our stud. So let's grab our axe real quick and see where we're at. I think we want to close it up just like that. That looks good. And let's put our stud, I think, right about there. Got one of these rotary punches, and I think we're going to want a 2.5 for that. And let's actually take the axe out of there. It'll be a little bit easier to get at. What I'm going to do, and this is actually going to be, I'm going to be putting the stud on this side, but I'm going to punch the smaller hole here, because that'll hopefully help me line up where I need to punch my next hole for that guy. There's that. Where's my pen at? I'm going to carefully mark this with my pen. Let's see if we can actually get quite up in there. Ooh, it's a squeeze, but we are just about there. All right. Now all we need to do is actually make this hole bigger and cut a notch so we'll actually have the flexibility to get our stud over that. And I think this is the right hole. If not, it's going to be a real big bummer, but whatever. We will overcome. Well, there's no going back now. Let's hope that was the right size, or at the very least, too small. Let's put our stud in. And I did notice that this is definitely the right size hole. If you put it in the side that you punched, it's much easier to get it through the first time. But nonetheless, we wiggle in there. We will get this in. And I suppose if I was smarter, I would have just done this first. But where would be the fun in that? But we can just screw this through and the threads will pull it up. There we go. Then, let's see. We're going to cut our relief, let's say right about that way. Use this mat just so it gives us a little bit of extra height. Just cut a little bit of a relief and we'll check how that is. And keep in mind, this is going to break in. So you want this to be a little on the too snug side, because obviously it'll loosen up, but if it's too loose, there's no way to get it tighter. So that's it without the axe. Now let's see how it is with the axe. And, oh no, it's too small. What are we going to do? The answer is, we're actually going to wet form this. So, I'll be right back. I'm going to put a little bit of oil on here and some saran wrap to hopefully stop this from rusting. And actually, if it corrodes a little too much, it'll actually mark up the inside of your sheath. Not the biggest deal, but something to keep in mind. So I'm going to protect this as best I can. And then this, I'm actually going to run this under just hot tap water. You don't need to stick this in a boiling pot or anything like that. So I will be right back. All right, we're back. I've got my axe protected, and I've got my sheath all wet and warm, and I've just wiped off any sort of dripping water. You want it sort of saturated, but you don't want the water all over your desk. And as you can see, we're on there. So I'm going to leave this overnight to dry, and we will be all done. Well, actually, leaving this overnight to dry, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to put the top coat on there. All right, now our sheath is dry, so we can pull it off and have a look. Our saran wrap has protected our sheath, and look at that. Our stud works just fine. It's a little snug right now, but remember that this is going to break in, so it's better to have it a little snug now than have it loose now and get unusable as the sheath breaks in. So we've got one last step. We'll set the axe out of the way for now. And that step is to finish. We're going to be using some Atom Wax today. It's really easy to use and just takes a couple minutes. And I'm just going to apply this with a dauber. You want to just liberally apply it all over the piece. You want to work relatively quickly because you don't want an edge to start drying. All right, I think we got just about everything. We'll get the edges real quick. All right. And now from here, we are just going to wipe this off and start buffing. As you can see, we're already starting to get a little bit of a shine here. All right. And there we have our finished axe sheath.